Also, I would like to start with Yasmine CANDAU. Please tell me why this evaluation, this assessment of care and caregivers by the patients is necessary. Well, first of all, I would like to talk to you a little bit about EndoFrance, our association. This is an association that has been created 20 years ago, and we have 2,700 participants right now, and 700 people who are working on a voluntary basis, organizing events every year in France, and they have 50,000 emails coming from patients that would like to have explanations about the disease and so on. Of course, we are certified by the Ministry of Health in order to represent all of these users, and we're also members of the France Santé, Association of Health of France. I would like to talk to you about the endometriosis, and this is the disease that I'm defending, and I am also affected by it, but I believe that this is also something that will be very much valid for a lot of other diseases, especially chronic diseases. I would like to go back to the situation that we can see today a lot. We have a big difference in the knowledge level about this disease among doctors, because endometriosis is the disease that actually is for which we need 7 to 10 years in order to diagnosis. So the patients most of the time have to look for the information themselves. They have to look the information about the disease, but also about the doctors and the treatments. So where will they get this information? Well, they will get it online. So they will come to see their doctors with information. Whether this information will be good or bad, it will depend on the sources that they will use. And of course, this will have an impact on the meeting that they have with the doctor. So on the basis of the information that the patients have collected, they will choose to accept or not the treatment that will be offered. And they will also choose the doctor. And for that, they will be based on they will base their judgment on the assessments that they have found online. So this will be Google. There will be also Not Tondoc, this platform that is also very well known. This will be also the discussion groups and the forums that we have on social media, where nobody has subjective opinions, but this will be people who have exactly the same disease, which is why the value of these messages will be much more important. So this will also affect the relationship between the doctor and the patient, because everyone is unique and we have many different shapes that the disease can take, especially the disease that affects women, which is why I would like to go back to what you have said in the introduction, this medical consumerism, or I would say even medical tourism. So we decide not to go, and we just do not let people know about this. So what we can see today is that patients will not only assess the technical competency of the doctor that they will go and see, they will also evaluate their empathy, because today empathy is perceived as superior to the medical response that is expected. And because of this, our role as an association is to pretty much give the clear information, informed information, I would say, about endometriosis, about everything that where we have participated in, all the organizations that we have participated in, and then give the right directions in order to try and preserve the relationship between the patient and the doctor. And to conclude, I also would like to say, and we have heard it this morning, it's important to participate the patient in the construction together with institutions and doctors in order to define the best treatment together. And I believe that this will be an important pillar to preserve the therapeutic relationship and the therapeutic alliance. We already know that we have good doctors, but also good doctors that will not be very empathic. But the ideal is to have empathic doctors and good doctors, and this is very difficult to find. So this small courses, the advisors that we have on Google, is this enough to somehow qualify the relationship between the doctor and the patient? No, of course, there is a lack of subjectivity here. So each and every person will write their own opinion, which is why we actually need to have a lot of objectivity whenever we are sending someone to see a doctor. We have to talk about the skills, the competencies, to say you are in this stage, so which is why you need this and that skill, and we would like to orient you to send you to this doctor or that doctor. But we also know the doctors that we are sending patients to, so we actually have to find the perfect match here and try and find somebody who will be very nice and who will take their time and so on. What is also very interesting when I was looking at these classifications, because I actually asked Google to come, Google and TripAdvisor to come and talk to us about this, but they don't ever want to share their information and their secrets. But what I have noticed is that sometimes we have someone who would have 5 stars and someone who would have just 0. So they will have nothing in the middle. So either someone loves them, someone hates them. I believe that sometimes comments are either hidden or deleted, but indeed this is pretty much that. So it's the time that the doctor has given and the sympathy that has been manifested by the doctor and so on. So all of this is taken into account by the patients that did this assessment. I also would like to, now I would like to give the floor to Jérôme, VILLEMINOT, who is basically on the other side of this. Well, the assessment obviously is our assessment, but at the same time is somehow the self-evaluation, safe assessment of the patient of their treatment, because whenever I'm treating someone, I'm not doing it for me, but for them. So the feedback from their meaning their evaluation, their assessment, I would say that the assessment is here to help us treat them better. Is there much more for this than to get on top of Google classifications and so on. So we should measure better in order to treat better, and the idea that the patient can assess us and can assess his or her treatment through this self-assessment that actually does not, comes from an independent source and not through the doctor. It actually allows us to get a better measure and a better interpretation, and I believe that this is fundamental, which is why we have to use this assessment, either the assessment of the caregiver or of the treatment, as a tool for a constant improvement of our practices instead of using it just as a judgment. I believe that we have to use all of these assessments in order to evolve our practices and to improve overall the quality of the practices and the perception of the patients, but also especially the satisfaction of the patient, because that's our main question. We practitioners are very often very much satisfied by what we do, but we don't really pay attention to whether the patient is satisfied. And through this constant assessment, constant evaluation tool that we have, we also can notice that very often our own satisfaction is not the same as the satisfaction of the patient. But to evaluate what the patient would like to have after the operation, it actually can change a lot of things, because the expectations of a patient are not the same from one patient to another for the very same treatment. And having this information, because starting from the very beginning of this morning, we have been talking about the data, the information. Well, we don't only have to measure it, but also to use it. And I am orthopedist and a surgeon, and I'm working with the knees especially. So thanks to the data given by the patient, I know that in the 48 first hours, the pain basically conditions the results that we will have for the next days. So those who have a lot of pain in the upcoming 48 hours, they will not be able to walk after 28 days. But those who don't have a lot of pain, they won't have this situation. So it's been 20 years plus since I started working here. And sometimes some patients, some doctors will say, it's not very bad if the patient is very painful because, well, actually they went through this surgery and so on. But we understand that probably this is not just as good as they pretended to be. So if we don't go looking for this data, and the patient themselves, they don't really have this regular way or like continuous way to go and see me, probably I will see them during the surgery and then some weeks later and so on. So the fact that they are giving us regularly their data, it actually allows us to really see this evolution and no longer address just the memory of the patient when we see them like 2 to 3 weeks later. And at the same time, when we have this constant follow-up, it actually establishes this huge link between us and patients. We are doing it through this digital platform, just as my brother was saying before that. The digital or the telemedicine also create important links. And I was quite surprised when I started using this kind of platforms and looking at all the data. I was quite surprised because we are quite afraid that telemedicine or digital will remove this human aspect. But finally, this is not the case. And we have this impression that the follow-up is done much better. Because, just to be honest, when a patient is in the hospital, in 3 days, if they say, if they can see a doctor for 10 minutes in total, this will be just great. So today, this data that we are finally getting also allows us to create a lot of things around it for the orthopedics, for instance, we have this National Professional Council of the Orthopedic Surgeons. They have taken this data that we have given them, and they are trying to create the databases that we don't have in France yet. But we would like to make it evolve and go even farther, because sometimes we're talking about the processes and so on, whether it will be used 20 years after and so on, and we would like to know whether the patient is active with it. And what we would like to have is the real information about the practices, the database of the practices that will be implemented by the patient themselves. And what is also very important is for it to be self-assessment. And you can see there is this evaluation. There is the doctor and the patient and everyone. So we're basically acting around this evaluation. So it's also important for this evaluation to be done at their home and not just in front of the patient, because in front of the doctor, because in front of the doctor everything is well. And let's say this man who had a surgery for a surgery and so on, and for his prostate, and then he will say that everything is well, but his wife will say that there's a problem. So now we have been talking about the high authority in health, and now we would like to go to the industry and technology. Lucile, BLAISE, do you have any assessments, evaluation beyond all this protocol, and apart from all the protocols that you're doing in the real time, do you have evaluations and assessments throughout the life cycle of the product? Yes, of course. First of all, from the point of view of the regulations, because we are obliged to do it. It's mandatory for us to do the evaluations in terms of safety, usability, or performance, but also in the digital world. Performance is not just my product works or my device works, is to know whether it's efficient and whether it actually brings something. Well, we have this sleep apnea, so we can say whether this particular medical tool is performant, whether it works or not, or probably the performance is not just the right efficiency throughout the transmission of the data. So just from the point of view of its nature, the regulations is imposing on us this post-market surveillance in order to have a continuous improvement of all of our products. From the other point of view, yes, of course, the devices, medical devices in particular, are a vector of transmission and communication and information toward the patient. And today, in a lot of different fields, especially in the chronic pathological diseases, we are not just a provider of products, but we are providers of ecosystems that allow us to have this full cycle with the patient, that probably will allow us to improve the care, exchange the feedback, collect the data, transmit it to the patient and through the telemedicine, and have a lot of different applications with the patient. And it actually allows us to have the cycle and to improve our products. Very recently, from a company called RESMED, we have launched this new platform, which is the very first platform of the treatment for the sleep apnea. And we are basically collecting all the different information with respect to this. So basically, we are trying to reduce the symptoms of wanting to go to sleep. And these are very simple questions like, do you sleep well, or things like that. But just these two questions that we're using here have already shown us that throughout this very first protocol for 18 to 19 patients, just the fact of the improvement of their symptoms throughout the therapy at 1 month and 6 months also has shown us the improved observancy. So this follow-up that we're doing here gives us an opportunity to have an interaction with the patient, because this is actually a physical act, and also to have this communication, because starting from this morning we have been talking about the tailor-made approach, personalization, and so on, and we have been talking about the journeys and so on, but we are talking much more about data than about patients. So my question was, why? Well, because in order to have this assessment, this evaluation done by the patient, we actually have to have this exchange of information, this communication, and this communication is actually data, which is why we are talking about this. Thierry, the same question for the pharmaceutics. Well, for the pharmaceutics, therapeutics, I would say that there's multiple aspects here. Well, first of all, there was this restructuration of what we have as a system, but also with the social media. We have a lot of feedback from the patients about their treatment, and it actually also allows us to understand a lot of things with respect to the pharmacovigilance. And within the last couple of years, we actually have seen that we have to go even further, because all of this is not sufficient, and we really have to integrate the patient into our DNA. So when I'm saying integrate the patients into our DNA, it means that we have to really understand what are the expectations of the patients. Because 20 years ago, we have been working on a certain type of cell, of cancerous cell, with a certain, that will work with a certain molecule that will be targeting especially this cancer cell. Yes, potentially, because this is something that will help to heal, but the expectations of the patient affected by cancer can go beyond that. And this is why we have to place the patient into the very core of our DNA. And for that, we have to start acting. And start acting, this actually happens through the training and education of our teams, meaning that we have to make them understand that the patients today, as well as their expectations, are also part of the pharmaceutical industry, and we have to take them into account. The typical example would be the clinical development. So when you have a new molecule, we will do this clinical development. We will try to have the protocol that will be corresponding to the objective criteria with transparency and so on and so forth. But we have to take into account the expectations for the patient and consider also the time that they spend at this hospital will be part of their experience. So we have to work with them and to see what are the hurdles and the obstacles that exist here. How can we optimize their experience here, optimize what goes beyond the treatment option, even if we don't have the existing therapeutic alternatives. So how can we make this integrated into our company? How can we welcome this and include it into our processes? Because this is something that is crucial for us. So what can we do here? Well, first of all, we have already established this in the pharmaceutical establishment through the drugs. We have this charter of interaction between patients and patient associations, so that to have these clear rules. And then for us, it's also very important to listen to our patients. Listen to our patients, meaning integrate them into the reflection committee, the think tanks. That's what we did in the committee of l'INADIRAL, meaning that we had patients around the table in order to have their feedback, but also it allows us to give them the floor so that patients and associations of patients, very often, they don't have the experience of media communication in order to have some visibility. So we have the means to help them, to create some forums, so that to allow them to express themselves. And through that, we will be able to understand, to listen. And just to give you a couple of examples, you all remember this huge plan, cancer plan, at the beginning of the years 2000, something like that, and we had this patient who came back, patients who came back, and in their journey, they had this very complicated moment, and this was the announcement of the diagnosis. And I believe that we have informed about this all the colleagues in France. This was the announcement of the diagnosis, and we have informed everyone about that, and this was a huge progress. So when we have listened to a group of patients, we understood that we didn't train our pediatric colleagues. So we actually acted upon it. We created this initiative. We created a working group, an association, in order to solve this problem. So this is a very concrete example. So while listening to our patients, we can understand how to improve their journey in the treatment. We're also talking a lot about measures, and I believe that you have been talking about it. So it's very interesting, you said, after the surgery, to see what will be the level of pain, because this will have an impact some weeks later or some months later. But we actually have this trend to do the imagery right there and then without looking at this progression in time. And this is why we have been working a lot with patient associations in order to really analyze the journey of the treatment of these patients overall. And unfortunately, here we have a lot of different chunks. So for us, what is very important is to basically recreate this whole movie, recreate this whole journey of the patient from the very beginning and until the very end. So where do we have to intervene? Just to give you a very last example, let's say a very young woman who starts the fecundation in vitro because she would like to have a child. And we have measured the satisfaction by the injecting pen. How can we manage pain and so on. But have we really measured her overall journey from the very moment that when this lady started seeing that she had some difficulties in having children, and until the point when years and years later she will finally have a baby, and how all this pain that she has accumulated before that is managed? Because if we would like to talk about this assessment for the journey around of the treatment journey for the patient, we actually have to put every factor here on the table from A to Z, as I say. And just to conclude, I would like to say is that our must is to really train the collaborators to do this. We have all to do this. We have to show everyone that this is crucial. And I was talking to Dominique just before that, to Dominique GULUDEC. I was telling him that this transparency is very important, but we actually have to put our patient even more in the front line and to show all of this, because this is something that will allow us to progress, to inform absolutely everyone, and to also make the society evolve. So, Dominique GULUDEC, we have been talking a lot about the evolution of the products by the patients, but I would like to go to the assessment of care and the caregivers. So just to say something very simple. In France, for the caregivers, we don't really have any assessment, any evaluation. For French doctors, they actually believed for a very long time that they don't need it. So the only evaluation that we have here is the evaluation peer-to-peer, and it actually works quite well, but it actually only touches a very limited number of doctors. But I can also tell you that we have this periodic certification, which is a self-assessment as well of a doctor that will basically start doing it, but we are still very far from that, because this is just self-assessment. So for the doctors, I think well, the situation is quite clear. Now, for the treatments, for the care, we have different tools, and they depend on what you're looking for. We have done something very interesting, and these are the results seen by the patients. This is called prompts, and we are using them in order to evaluate a product or the whole of the care. And these are the tools that we have developed. We actually have these guidelines in order to build these prompts that will be generic or specific for a certain pathology. But these are tools that each and every team has to use and learn to use, and then analyze the data and take it into account in their practices. And also, we have this very important part, which is the patient experience and patient satisfaction. This is biased data, subjective data. Nevertheless, this is important data. And in France, we are quite in advance. We have this tool that works quite well. The problem is that we don't really use it. That's the situation in France very often. We do have a lot of good tools, but we don't always use them. So we have ECDs, which is the questionnaire that is sent to all the hospitalized patients everywhere where they are hospitalized. So that's a poll, a questionnaire. And I can tell you that we receive a lot of answers, and whenever the establishments have to send us the emails of the patients, and we send them this poll, and we have a lot of interesting answers. But the establishments don't communicate a lot of emails to us, and this is very bad. Why? Because we could have done a statistics at the level of the establishment if we have enough answers, but we cannot do it at the level of the team. So in order to integrate it into the improvement of the care, this point of view of the patient, we actually have to go down to the level of the team, so that the team would be able to look at their own results and to say, oh, there's a problem here, so we have to improve it, to do something. So we actually can have it, and the technology helps us a lot here, but as you can see, we still have a lot of obstacles, a lot of hurdles with respect of the implementation of this polls. So we also, in these questionnaires, we have some space for the free comments, but we don't really know how to analyze it. We don't really have the time to analyze it, and we decided that throughout the artificial intelligence we would be able to do it and save some time, and that's an incredible progress and wealth for us. But there is this, you can click in our website and just know what the patients are saying in one establishment or another, but right now when we're saying that we are putting it in a transparent way and publicly accessible, people are not really happy about this. So you can see that from the operational point of view, we have a lot of things. We have a lot of tools. So a lot of things are basically done at the level of the teams when it has to be at the initiative of the professionals. We have also some tools at the national level, but we have to increase the use of all of this. In the service where I was working, we created a questionnaire starting from the listening of 5 patients who were treated for cancer, and we did this questionnaire 5 years later, and we actually did it one afternoon. So we basically gathered them and we asked them to share with us their story, and we learned a lot, really a lot. And we were able to create this questionnaire of 10 questions that was sent by email 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years later, and so on, and it actually worked very well. So what I want to say here is this is really not difficult. These questions can be very simple. Yes, what I wanted to say is that this assessment, this evaluation has to be an integral part of the treatment. So when we are talking about the evaluation of the treatment and of themselves for the patients, that's very important because the doctors have to accept the ownership of this notion, and they have to accept to be evaluated through this system, because I believe that I know the rates of satisfaction that are quite good, but in the platform that I'm using, I have approximately 84% of the response rate for people who are responding to all of these polls, knowing that sometimes we can have 2 to 3 of them per week with 10 questions each. Well, so the professionals have to get the ownership of all of this and sell, I would say, sell this evaluation to the clients by saying this is your assessment, your evaluation. And also what is important is that whenever we are asking the patient to put a score, well, for me, for the knee, this will be like the less pain you feel, the better it will be. So, of course, for them, it will be preferable to put a good grade, a good score than a bad one. So either they will make an effort to put for themselves a good score because they are doing all the exercise that I've asked them to do. So either they will be cheating or they will be making this effort because they have put a good score for themselves and they will have to apply it in practice. And for me, this result also will influence my practices. And in the platform, we basically have the result of the patient, which is compared anonymously to the overall results of all of the patients that have exactly the same pathology that are present in this platform. And I also have a colleague in Paris who noticed that at J+7, at D+7, some 7 days after the surgery, basically, some patients were feeling better than the others. And for some, the pain was coming back later on. So this is why I was saying that we have to measure better in order to better treat. So this assessment, this evaluation will basically motivate better everyone, patients and doctors. What would you like to do, Yasmine, to say, Yasmine CANDAU, with respect to all of this? Well, personally, I can say that I have had surgery many times, but I have never received any poll or any questionnaire, and this is quite terrible because this is quite a quite negative situation. So yeah, you have to complain. You have to complain because unfortunately this is something that exists, and I can tell you that this questionnaire has a lot of information. Well, for the assessment, what is also quite complicated when we are talking about complicated treatments, and sorry that I'm talking about this, is that once the surgeon has done his or her work, they will say, well, okay, my work is done. Now you can go and see your general practitioner or gynecologist or gynecologist or whatever. And well, sometimes I would have a visit with the surgeon for 2 to 3 months after, but then it stops. But I still have pains. So who will evaluate it? Because the JP or the gynecologist would say, I don't know. Well, which is why I'm talking about this connection, this link, because we have the follow-up protocols for 1 year after the surgery, 2 years after the surgery. That's true. We will not be meeting our patients every 2 weeks or 3 weeks and so on. But throughout this evaluation process that we have and that we require from the patient still can see that we are taking care of them. And this is just to make sure that the patient participate in their treatment, to make them really participate. Yeah, I believe that this is also a huge factor of commitment and participation of the client, of the patient. Yeah, I believe that the opinion of the patient is also very important in order to continue working with them throughout this process. Well, in my field, I also can say that we have some interventions that can have different results, but we never have the pre-operative questionnaire. So sometimes this also complicates the situation a lot. And yes, indeed, I have talked to some of my colleagues, and they would say, yeah, we should have questionnaires that should be filled before the surgery to know whether the sexual life of this person who will be operated is all right or not at the moment before the operation, and so on. So we need this information. I believe that this is very interesting. So we have to have these questionnaires pre-surgery for prostate. Yeah, well, I would say that with a parity of women at this round table, I can say that you are kind of confusing me. Well, I believe that the PROM, the tool that I have been mentioning, is a very interesting tool. And in addition to the result, that means that the professionals can learn a lot. That's a very interesting factor to make patients participate in the follow-up of their own disease. But that's also very interesting from the collective point of view to improve the system and to improve the treatment. Yes, we are developing a lot of guidelines, how to create these PROMs, how can we create digital PROMs, specific PROMs per disease, and so on, because there's a lot of things that we have here. So what is the advantage and inconvenience of each and every questionnaire that we have, how to build up a questionnaire that will be like tailor-made and so on. How can we, well, when we have a very severe disease or a certain given surgery, that can be quite easy. But if we can have much more complicated cases here, well, at the level of the PROM, we are basically talking about several questions. So if I just can speak about this, I can say that the PROM CTs has approximately 60 to 70 questions, and some of them are quite dissuasive. Well, we have over 90% of people who are answering all of the questions. Well, from one institution to another, from one establishment to the other, we have from 0 to 100% of people participating in this for the PROM. And we cannot do this round table without talking about CHAM, because it's very important for us also to gather the scientific associations and every other stakeholder in order to come up with several questions, but they will make sense, because otherwise it becomes really, really difficult. And this is true that the technologies should be the tool that will allow us to transmit this information. And another key point here is the transparency, because it's very good to have a lot of specific questions, but the difficulty is that how can we compare all this data later on? So, yeah, of course, it actually can create some problems here. We can see in the northern countries we have a lot of examples like that, where the transparency by using the PROM questionnaires that have been shared, it actually improved the practices, because it allows us to have the emulation. Yeah, it can definitely improve the practices, but we need to be able to compare it. Yes, and I'm still thinking about my own field. I could never know whether I was part of the average from the statistical point of view at the national level in terms of my own field. And no surgeon, urologist in France could position themselves and say, I'm in the middle or beyond or above or below. And this is something that scares me, because we are doing our operations without knowing it. And, well, of course, we have to be better than the other one, that our colleague, Jérôme, we all know this, but in reality, the country has no evaluation, no statistics that allow to each and everyone to position themselves. And I would like to ask the following question to know, why wouldn't we use an application, an app, when we go at the pharmacy and we would buy in a drugstore, we would buy something, well, let's say an app that would have all the symptoms that will be there already, in order to have the small signs of complications or comorbidities and so on. So why didn't we come up with something that would be so simple? Well, this will be a medical tool. Well, so why don't we do this? That's the question that I'm asking. This would be very, very simple. So I'm buying this, and I'm just putting it into my app, and then I'm also putting down, like, let's say I'm vomiting or I'm feeling bad and so on and so forth. So then the authorities will know it, and the the doctors will know all this information as well, and the authorities will know this information as well. Well, I would like to offer you to do a startup with this around this idea, because the technologies are giving us a lot of opportunities today, and well, probably patient is not really the topic that is part of the pharmaceutical industry in itself. Nevertheless, this is the topic that is very relevant to the society. And when we're looking at the biotech, we have a lot of apps, of connected devices, but also medical tools in order to do the follow-up for the patient. I have this startup that is in Lyon, not far from here, and they created this small robot that looks like an M&M's. And this robot will do the follow-up with the patient and support them when they're doing their injections. So children are playing with this robot, and the robot is giving them advice. So you can also ask them, so what can you suggest? Well, I would suggest for you to organize this kind of startup. But as for the National Agency of the Safety of Drugs and data, would you be agreeing with that? Well, we just need the very good, reliable data. Well, this will be your data. Well, I would say that for pharmacovigilance, of course, we are encouraging all the patients to talk about the secondary effects that they can have. But very few people do this. We don't really have this culture among the patients to go and do it. Well, they will go and complain, but themselves to go and to inform a certain association like the NSM or some other about this. They don't have this reflex. They don't do it. Very few people do it. Would you like to add something, Jérôme? Well, for me, this is something that is obvious. I have done it at my little level, and it actually allows us to really move forward and progress. But there's also this notion of sharing this data, meaning that if everyone collects their data in their own small corner but never shares it, it also can create a big problem. And today, an important number of hospitals, liberal hospitals, that they have different systems and they do not communicate among them, which is very complicated, because when a patient comes from another hospital, we cannot have their data. So that's also a big problem, the sharing of data among us, but also the sharing of this evaluation that we're talking about. I would like to go back to the question of the relevance, of the appreciation by the patient, because the professionals are always a little bit afraid of this bias coming from the patient and so on. Well, first of all, I would like to talk about the certification of the hospitals, because the role of the patient right now is major here, either for the methodology or for the references and references themselves, because the life of the patient, shared medical decisions are fundamental. So what I wanted to say is that we actually have two sources of appreciation around some indicators. Let's say the coordination after the hospitalization with the general practitioner. And we have an indicator, but we have to look through the files, and it actually takes a lot of time to fill this particular line related to this indicator. But we also have another indicator, whether your general practitioner has received your letter of end of hospitalization. But you can see that it's a completely opposite situation. So the opinion of the patient is not something that we will be looking for in the files, but we can basically use it. Yeah, but what is also very interesting is that there is an indicator that no one is using, and this is the rate of patients who will not be having a surgery in the hospital, who will just turn their back on it and flee. But this is absolutely scary, because when we were looking at the hospitals, we had a foreign surgeon who was given the surgery, and he had 2 people who died and 3 people who had important comorbidities and side effects later on. But this person continues to work here despite these bad results. In the other hospital, we have 3 surgeons, and we have 550 surgeries per year, meaning that these numbers are very important for them. But we also have 90% of people who wouldn't go there. So the rate of people who fled was very important. In the market, people were sharing the information. So all the youngsters were all the people from the younger population, they already knew it, that they didn't have to go there. But there was no official data about all of this, so we can see it. You are doing this consultations? Yes, we are doing this because sometimes people have to cross the whole of France in order to go and have their surgery, especially if they have some very severe forms of disease. And we are also sending them to the surgeons who have a very important rate of successful surgeries, especially complex surgeries per year. And we also send them to the surgeons who have very few problems after the surgeries. And you are telling them, yes, of course, because we have participated in a lot of professional congresses for doctors, and we are basically tracking this data of how many successful surgeries they have had and so on and so forth. So we have this notion. Do you believe that we have to create something like that in France, because we don't have it in France? So if the co-founders would agree with us, should we create something like hostels? We actually have some of them in Sweden, where women, let's say, they have to go and give birth, and they will go, I don't know, very far in order to give birth. And it will be in winter under the snow, and they will go there some days before, and they will stay in hostels or hotels or something like that. Well, in France, do you think that we should create something like that? Because the elected officials for now are still saying blah, 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 and blah, 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 and not really giving us the solution to this. Because when you need to go through that much distance in order to get a surgery, this is quite bad. Well, I can say that things have been quite changed, are changing, because Emmanuel Macron has announced in January new measures, and right now we are doing something with this respect in the whole of French territory, because for us it's important to make sure that the care will be provided to all the patients, and to make sure that this care is provided locally, so that they wouldn't have to leave their own territory. But this is first of all about the primary care, so those who are in the front line, and some of them don't really know how to do correctly a diagnosis and so on, which is why we're fighting against it, and that's what we have to fight against, meaning that the association has to be adopted. We have to know how to diagnose the endometriosis without waiting 7 to 10 years, and this is something that is also part of the studies, but part of the studies we have included this in the program. Nevertheless, the very first course, after it was accepted, was only administered for the first time in 2021. And also what I wanted to add here is that we, in the Faculty of Medicine, we really don't teach them how to communicate. They learn everything, but not the communication. It starts coming little by little, because we understand what the problem is. Because if we ask them what is amour, what is love, and they would say, well, this is the river in Russia. So that's what we have to do, because the first thing is the contact. First thing is the contact. Yeah, I wanted to come back to the very last point at the interest that represents this assessment by the patients, at the care and caregivers. We have been talking about this predictive aspect of the medicine, but also the personalization, the tailor-made medicine. So we need to collect a lot of data, and the fact of collecting a lot of data allows us, with a couple of questions that are asked before the surgery, to be able to predict who would have a rather good result and who would have a not so good result, and adapt ourselves before the surgery, before this result, so that to try and change something and to have at least some influence on it. So what we're trying to do today is to have this personalization, customization, but not only this customization of the protocol, but also the customization of my way of interacting with this patient, because, well, I'm used to have this kind of general attitude, but probably for some patients it will be important for me to adopt my attitude with respect to the answers that they have given me before the surgery. So I believe that this is this predictive aspect, because if we don't have the evaluation of the patient, of their care and caregivers, it will be very difficult to do it if we don't have this information before the surgery. Thank you very much for this round table, ladies and gentlemen.